Book of Genesis tonight, but in order to do it, I would like to make a jump to the book of Exodus and then look back at Genesis, because I think it'll put it in a different perspective. And what we're going to do now is look at the way the book of Genesis came about, or look at the way that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, came about. And in order to do that, we need to get acquainted with this man who is credited with writing them, this man Moses. And our story tells us that there was a period when Egypt was the benefactor of Israel. And this is the time of the life of Joseph, when Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt. But there came in Egypt at that time a very special Pharaoh, who was very different from any Pharaoh who had ruled before him or anyone that ruled after him. He was, in fact, the first of the pharaohs to establish the worship of the one God in Egypt. And essentially what he tried to do was to take the great host of gods that Egypt worshipped and relate all of those to aspects of God, so that instead of making them gods, they were the attributes of one God. And so he rededicated all of the temples of Egypt, and this sort of thing was happening under the influence of Joseph, who had become an advisor to that particular Pharaoh. So we have two things coming together in one story. If we looked at the history of Egypt, we find this long succession of pharaohs, all of whom were trained in the mystery schools of Egypt and were trained by the wise men of Egypt. And in their training were given keys to initiation, spectacular keys actually, because the Egyptians had some extraordinary wisdom. We're talking about the nation of people who built the Great Pyramid and who built a number of other things in their land which, according to archaeologists and historians, were impossible to build as they built it. With the knowledge that they were supposed to have had, it's not supposed to be possible for them to do what they did. But they created these great structures with an obvious knowledge of geometry and a superior knowledge of the use of tools of some sort. What sort we really can't say, because they were able to cut stones to tolerances that even our instruments of today can't accomplish. So they had some superior technology, some superior wisdom, and knew how to do things according to legends and stories that we encounter that we don't know how to do today. Things like levitating stone and spectacular methods of healing and so on. These secrets were kept by the Egyptian priests, and they created very elaborate universities for the purpose of keeping this knowledge for the initiates of Egypt. And they created with their knowledge special temples for this sharing, and we'll take a brief look at what this university was like. They built a building with a balustrade in front that was a sort of the front entrance of the temple, and these always were adorned with statues that were dedicated to life or death. If it was life, the figure on the front had 1 foot forward, and if it was to death, the feet were side by side. So there were funeral temples and these living temples, or temples of life. And in the one temple, the life temple, they were taught the secrets of life. In the funeral temple, or the death temple, they were taught of the 12 gates of death, the tradition of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Now, inside this front balustrade there was a courtyard, and this first courtyard was a place of study. It was in itself a college or university or a school, but everything that was taught in this first courtyard was available to any young man in Egypt who showed enough promise, enough interest in study, enough aptitude to be curious. Where a young man was discovered to have the quality of mind that could learn to read and write, for example, but he had to be superior in his consciousness. He had to be superior enough to be noticed. And in fact, there are interesting stories about this. One of the stories that comes down to us is of a young man who was taken into this school. And you would think that this child, being discovered to be such an extraordinary person, his parents would be absolutely delighted at his discovery. But it wasn't the case. His parents learned very early of his superior interest in things around him, his curiosity, his fascination with learning, noticed his superior intellect, and they immediately tried to hide it so that the priest wouldn't discover it, because if it was not discovered, he remained at home with his parents to work the farm and make money. If it was discovered, then he went away to the temple to learn, and then he belonged to the country, and the father lost him as an economic factor. So whereas at once the parents were flattered that the child was accepted into this aristocracy, they at the same time were a little dismayed at losing this economic factor that was important to their life. So it became the job of some of the priests then, in going about the countryside, to discover these superior youngsters, and they were taken into this first school. In this first school they were taught to read and write. They were taught just the basics of what we would call maybe a liberal arts education, something like that, but not the spiritual secrets. Now they did learn the gods of Egypt. They learned Egyptian cosmology. They learned the exoteric teachings of the religion of Egypt in this first school. There's a second school behind this with a long corridor that leads to it, and this corridor is generally surrounded on both sides by pillars, and then another school. I'm not going to have room to finish that temple because it goes up here. Maybe I better start the drawing again in a moment. If the youngster showed superior ability in this school, and if in fact in addition to the superior learning ability here, he also showed a side that had an ability to understand or be interested in the mystic side of things. This is sort of difficult to put into words, but you can have a very left brain intelligent youngster. He learns math beautifully well and all of the logical things, but he doesn't have a particular interest or an ability to see life in nature, to see nature as living, to comprehend the world of the spirit. If he was that type of youngster who did not show a fascination for the world of spirit and life beyond logic, then he never went any further than this school, the peristyle school as it was called, and or called later by the Greeks, by the way. But in this initial school, this was the practical trades, reading, writing, arithmetic, the basics of education. One who showed interest in the spiritual things was taken further then, and in this this colonnade school, at the pillars there, the youngsters who went beyond that were assigned an individual teacher instead of studying as a classroom group, and in this grouping they were prepared for another step. Now at each one of these doors there's an interesting part of the architecture here, because over this entrance is usually built a room which archaeologists interpret as a guardhouse, where the guards can stand above and look down on the people and say who can come and go. One of the things that you'll find interesting if you visit Egypt is maybe I better be careful here, the presumptuousness of the archaeologists at telling you this is what that was, when what they think that it was is an absurd application of what it really was. And this is one of them. This guardhouse over the entrance was really a ceremonial place where the teachers standing here and looking down at the youngsters required them to respond appropriately for initiation into the next school. It was really a ceremonial thing. It was not a military thing, not a guardhouse in that sense, but a place where the initiator examined the initiate, and by using the right words, the right responses to the questions, he was given entry to the next level of the temple. And so there was another of these here, a place of examination. But this middle section was a place where these youngsters were prepared for the initiation into the hypostyle hall, which is the next school. In this next school, then, they were given the esoteric application of the exoteric teaching, meaning that if a youngster in the peristyle hall was taught that the sky is the goddess Nut, and she is this woman with her hands on the earth in one place and feet on the earth in the other, and her body arched over the earth, then in the peristyle school, when the youngster learned of this goddess Nut, he looked up, and in his imagination he always saw this great woman across the sky, and his consciousness took that very literally, that there was this great figure feeding the earth, and that her breasts gave nourishment to the earth, and this is the source of the clouds and the harvest that came, and so on. Once he went beyond that school and prepared himself for initiation into the other school, he began to understand the feminine principle that was the goddess Nut, and now from the exoteric teaching, the literal, he was being given the interpretative understanding that it was meant to reveal. Now, obviously, he had to have the kind of consciousness that could go from this concrete to the very abstract, and that was his key. Having that part of himself awakened allowed him to move from the one school to the other school. In this second school, then, he was given the esoteric, or the hidden meanings behind the stories that were given to the public about the Egyptian religion. If in this second school he indicated to his teachers, his initiators, an ability to discover things behind that, not if he showed the ability to learn it, but if he made statements to his instructors that indicated that he understood without being told, if his mind went a step further and discovered this is what's really being said, he was already finding himself understanding secrets from within himself that were not being told by the instructor. If this happened, then he went a step further into the next school. The next school was not really a school. It wasn't a classroom thing, and only one or perhaps two young men of any generation ever went into this third school. This was the school of the masters. There was in this third school a master who was a magician in the most true sense of that term, and the true sense of that term is he was magi. He was an initiate into the understanding of the application of universal energies in subtler ways, which meant that he is a man who could cause nature to respond to him. He could do things that appeared to be supernatural accomplishments. The kind of man who knew something about how the pyramids were built, how healing occurred, how to go beyond what appeared to be the limitations of the laws of nature. And so he would take this extraordinary student, only one or two in his lifetime. And in fact, each of the masters of one of these temples tended to spend his whole life searching for that one that he could make his initiate. And one of their, if they had a fear at all, their greatest fear was to die without finding that one that they could pass on their secrets to. So that student who qualified was a gift of gold to the teacher, and he delighted in being able to share all that he had and all that he was with his student. It was an extraordinary relationship because before he died, he actually passed on his life force to that student. It's the origin of such ceremonies as the blood brother ceremony, where there is the sharing of the blood from one to another. But this occurred from teacher to student in this mystery school of Egypt. Now what we find is that long before the period that we are now talking about, the esoteric teachings of these mystery schools had become more and more and more hidden. Because in the very early days of Egypt, now we're talking prehistory, in these early days, the pharaohs were selected by God through divine revelation to the master of the mystery school, which meant that being selected in a divine and spiritual way, this man obviously was a man prepared to receive the mysteries. Therefore, the Pharaoh always was trained in the mystery school and was given the secrets of the mystery school. However, it developed a little later that these pharaohs turned their rulership into dynasties, which meant that they passed on their rulership to their son, and then they were the selector of the next pharaoh rather than being by divine revelation of God, which disturbed the priests, who wanted to look at the new pharaoh and see, does he have the quality of consciousness that is ready to receive these secrets? If not, then because we're under the rulership of the pharaoh, we still will take him through all of the steps, but we won't reveal to him the secrets. So the secrets came to be hidden from the pharaoh without the pharaoh knowing it. And the difficulty of that was that the secrets were not always perpetuated at all. And so we find these two things in ancient Egypt happening. There was a mystical ceremony in which the pharaoh at his 40th birthday could be taken through a series of these temples, and through a series of purification rites, his youth was restored. The clock was turned back, and he was made younger in his body. His body was rejuvenated. And this would be done again and again and again, so that some of these pharaohs lived for 600 years or so. A little later, we find, a few generations later, a few thousand years actually, we find the same ceremony going on, but not working. So they're still going through the ritual of taking the pharaoh through all of these rites, but neither the priests nor the pharaoh knew the key to making the rite work. Now it becomes a parade, a celebration. All the people gather and watch the elaborate boats go by, but nothing happens to the pharaoh. He doesn't get any younger. And another example is that the ancient masters of the mystery schools had constructed a statue of pure gold. And the statue had to be specific dimensions, a specific size, specific shape. All of the planes and surfaces of the statue were important to its purpose. And its purpose was to be taken to the roof of the temple once a year, to be exposed to the sun for a particular period of time, and then taken back below into the temple. Now, this is a stone temple with a solid roof and no windows. You can imagine how black it was inside, except when this statue was charged with the sun and brought back into it, it was full of life, light, and energy. So the source of light inside this darkened room was this charged statue. And I wonder, by the way, if you make any connection in your consciousness between this and the Ark of the Covenant. Obviously, someone still knew the secrets. But the masters of the mystery schools didn't know how to make other statues like that, so the more recent temples you find have big openings, big windows to let light in, because they couldn't construct these power objects anymore to give light and power to the temple. So we find then this elaborate structure of mystery schools and esoteric traditions, the mystery schools still existing, the elaborate ceremonies still existing, but without the power that goes with it, coming down over a period of time to this Pharaoh, Akhenaten, who inherited the exoteric teachings, but not the esoteric. And from the exoteric teachings, he found himself worshiping many gods. If he had known the esoteric truth behind it, he wouldn't have been worshiping many gods. But he was. And Joseph comes into the country, and during this man's reign becomes identified as a mystic through interpretation of dreams. Now, because this Pharaoh was so taken with his ability with mysticism, he wanted to study with him. He had already studied with the masters of the mystery schools, and all he had gotten was a great string of gods and stories and legends of available power, but no real power behind it. But here is a man whose relationship with God really worked. So he sat with him and asked him, "Teach me about your God." And the first thing that Joseph taught him, obviously, was there is only one. And Akhenaten, of course, had grown up with thousands, literally thousands of gods, at least 60,000 at last count, and probably were more. There was a god for everything. Every animal was one of the gods. Every plant was one of the gods. And there was a god for polarity, a god for earth, god for heaven, god for the rivers, a god for the river bank. And here's this man telling him there is only one God, and that's the true God. And Akhenaten is saying to him, but what about all of these other things? I mean, obviously rain has an ability to bring life from the earth. And Joseph is telling him that is one of the abilities of God, but that is not another God. It's not a great family of gods. And so Akhenaten made a decree throughout the country. We're going to understand God in a different way. All of these things that we have called gods, now we're going to call aspects of God. And he changed the inscriptions on the temples. He rededicated the temples. He made a sweeping movement through all of Egypt, made Joseph a very important person. And can you imagine what happened? I mean, what does happen in an Arab country when you bring a Jew in and he changes everything, even the religion? Well, that's what happened. There was a rebellion against the Pharaoh, a rebellion against Joseph, a rebellion against the Jews that came into their country, who weren't Jews at the time, by the way. The word hadn't been thought of yet. And particularly the priests rebelled against the destruction of their exoteric religion. The interesting thing is they only had a framework. They didn't really have the essence behind it. Or if they did, it was quite a hidden undercurrent, and it was not available to be used by the government or the people of Egypt. It is likely that there were, here and there, hidden places. There were masters who were keeping alive the tradition to be revealed again at a time when the country was receptive to it. But these fellows who really didn't have the power behind their religion still wanted to maintain the form and rebelled against this change. So the reign didn't last very long, and the country changed back to their old religion. Joseph was dead now, and the family that he had left were dispersed through Egypt, becoming very successful, actually, as artisans, craftsmen, businessmen throughout the community. They were still very influential, but not as a political force and not as a religious force. Now, as time goes, then the rulers change. The dynasty actually changes. And you have a pharaoh, Ramses I, and I know there are people who are going to argue with this choice of periods of time when these things occurred. So once more, I'm just going to say this is not dogma, this is the way I see it. And Ramses became aware of this tribe of wanderers, people called Habiru, which meant nomads. These nomadic tribes among us are now running all our jewelry stores, all our loan offices, handling, and I'm not doing that as a type of Jews. I'm saying that quite literally. This is the business that they were in, working with gold, working with currency exchange, working with business, very successful in that way. Maybe, in fact, that's where the prototype comes from. But this amount of influence came to disturb him, and he began to give the Egyptian people the right to take over the property of any Jew who happened to be handy. All he had to do was take it and run it, so that no longer did these Habiru, or nomads, have property rights in Egypt. Now they became workers. They could not own a shop. They could work in a shop for somebody else, and they had very few rights of any kind. And he even passed a law because the nomads were reproducing too fast. He was afraid that very soon there would be more of the nomads in his country than of the native Egyptians. So he passed a law that all of the boys born to these nomad families must be destroyed at birth. And we come to the story of the birth of a very special young man. A man and woman, both of the tribe of Levi, the priestly tribe, have a child. The child is born, and the woman is concerned with how to preserve his life under this law and these conditions that have been passed, and hits upon this possibility of duplicating a story that is told in the tradition of the Egyptians. The story of one of their gods is that he had been born at a time when a law had been passed that new baby boys would be destroyed. So his mother put him in a reed basket and floated him among the reeds in the Nile. And he was discovered to be so beautiful that he was taken from the Nile by a princess and was raised in her home. Now, we can perhaps assume that the mother of Moses knew this story. Now, I want to point out that the story existed before Moses was born. It is an Egyptian story. It is the story of the birth of an Egyptian god. And perhaps through hearing this story, she considered perhaps this is the thing to do with my child. Or perhaps she didn't hear the story, but perhaps God knew the story and put it in her mind to do this same thing, because it's what she did. She made a basket and sealed it with pitch and set it floating among the reeds of the Nile, and left her older daughter there, whose name, by the way, was Mara, the waters of bitter experience, to watch over this basket and care for it. And the Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the water, and found the basket floating there with this beautiful child, fell in love with it, and adopted it. And then she decided that since this child was from the nomads, that perhaps one of the women of the nomads could serve as a nursemaid for this child and care for him in his growing up. So she put out the word, and Miriam, of course, or Mara, said, I know just the lady to take care of him, and she went and got his mother. So Moses and his mother moved into the palace with the family of the Pharaoh, and there he grew up as a grandson of the Pharaoh. Now, growing up under those conditions made the school available to him, and he grew up in a particular area of Egypt in which there were a series of schools, 3 of them actually. And if you remember the Casey stories of the Temple of Sacrifice, the Temple of Initiation, the Temple Beautiful, essentially you have those 3 schools, or the remnant of them much later, not actively alive, without the mysteries still being known, but the form of them was still alive in this particular location, the great palace of Ramses there, and down a sacred way, a pavement lined on each side by hundreds of sphinxes led from his palace to the mystery school, the temple in man. And this temple in man was one of the living temples. The balustrade in front of it was turned in such a way that it suggested a walking man rather than a man standing. Perhaps we can draw it this way. Columns here, and the great balustrades out in front, there and there. Does that look like anything vaguely to you? Maybe the body of a man? That is, in fact, what it was, the body of a man with the legs, the feet here. The spine is represented by a center column of pillars going through here. There was a room here, which I think is interesting in that it was called the birth room because it was surrounded inside with symbols of giving birth. And they wondered if royal births occurred there. That's what the archaeologists assume. Actually, when we're talking about a birth room in one of these sacred temples, we're talking about a new birth room, or the place where the consciousness was reborn. And here in this part, we have a holy place, the holiest of them all. Now, teaching occurred here. In these other places, teaching did not actually occur here, but the initiation occurred here. And it was the step that led them to the next place beyond it. The statues that are in front of this temple have the head of the statue cut off very neatly right across here, and the crown is missing. And if this is the body of a man, the crown is also missing from the temple. It only goes to the point of the third eye, but beyond that is missing. However, there are symbols on the wall which are interesting. Symbols that are sort of like this. You recognize it? It's called a scarab. What does it mean? Eternal life? Trinity? Yes, a scarab is a dung beetle. Okay, the assumption that is made by scholars is that this dung beetle must represent regeneration, because they picked a particular bug that plants its eggs in manure and comes out of this out of dung into new life. So it's sort of like the symbol of the phoenix. Now, all of this is made from the deduction of modern scholars looking at what the symbol must have meant just by the fact that it was a dung beetle. I mean, what would a dung beetle mean? So from their modern deductions, they have assumed that this is what the beetle meant. However, when we look at this temple, we get a little bit different idea. Interesting thing about this temple is that it is paved, the floor is paved all the way through with stones. And a man just a couple of generations back looked at those stones and thought, it's very strange that those stones are carved into such unusual shapes. They are not natural shapes. They didn't use the stones just as they are, but they carefully carved them into shapes. But the shapes are not shapes that make it easier for a stonemason. And if they don't make it easier for a stonemason, if they don't make the floor fit together better, if there's no rational, logical reason for cutting them that way, why did they cut them unless those shapes have some meaning? So he began to study the meaning of the stones, and he began to mark outlines around collections of stones. He found something very interesting, amazing in fact. He found that the paving stones in the floor of this give the shapes of all of the internal organs of the body, including the endocrine glands, which of course were not discovered until the 20th century. But all of these glands were perfectly placed in the right place, in the right order, all the way through the body and all the way up. And there were other symbols that, that seemed to relate to these. These endocrine glands themselves seemed to be very important as parts of this temple, because everywhere there was one of these 7 sets of glands, there were also markers on the walls of the temple relating to those glands. For example, the marker at the place of the genitals was a god, Amun-Ra, who was depicted on the walls with an erect phallus. And that only occurs around that area of that particular energy of the temple, giving the idea that not only are the organs carved into the floor, but something of the energy or the power, something that must have a relationship to it. Some significance is there. And as you go on up to the organs that are missing here, which are the pineal gland, the glands of the crown, or the crown chakra, instead of those symbols, there is this symbol. And it is a symbol that indicates the pineal and the right and left hemispheres of the brain, suggesting that our recent discovery in our generation, our discovery of hemispherical thinking, is something that was known by the Egyptians something like 4,000 years ago when they built this temple. And the most significant thing of it is that they left that part out of the temple. And their communication seemed to be, this is a temple on the earth, but it is not until you have gone through all of the initiations of the temple that you go beyond it. And the part that gives divine awareness or cosmic consciousness, the statement was, that part is not in this temple. That part cannot be in a temple of earth. We can take you this far. That other step is a heavenly step. That's essentially the statement of that particular temple. So this temple, the temple in man, is located just beyond the palace that Moses, or Mazis in ancient Egypt, grew up in. And he was almost certainly sent there to study. And every day, if you can imagine this, this young Hebrew boy, an adopted Egyptian, dressed as an Egyptian and part of royalty with servants surrounding him, and his mother as his maid, and whether he knew that she was his mother or not in the early days, we have no idea, but I think it is very unlikely that she would want herself to be revealed before he was old enough to understand the importance of keeping the secret. So here he came from school every day to spend time with his maid, who was undoubtedly anxious about what he had been taught. She has this Hebrew background, the Hebrew religion of the one God, the religion that Joseph, her great-grandfather, had taught to a pharaoh, and now the Egyptians have gone back to this great multitude of gods, and her son is being taught that there are this great multitude of gods. So I can just see her when he comes home from his studies in the peristyle hall each day saying, "What did they teach you?" And Mazis begins to describe what he was taught. There is this sun god, Ra, who drives a fiery chariot across the sky. And there is this retinue with him, his royal family, the Egyptian equivalents of Mars and Venus and the other planets traveling with him across the sky, and they visit 12 cities on their way. And they have their various different adventures in these 12 cities. And there are stories of Mars and Venus, of Ra and Hermes and Isis in their encounters with one another. And here is this maid mother who is worried about all of this, and she's praying about it, she's asking for guidance, and she's running every night to the local rabbi saying, what am I going to tell him? He's come home with more of these stories of Ra and the Egyptian gods. And there must have been an amazing little old rabbi around the corner, because he said, what you want to do is not tell him all of that is balderdash, because it's being put into him. I mean, you can't just reject it. What you want to do is give him another understanding of it. When the Egyptian teachers tell him that there are these 12 cities in the sky, or 12 gods in the sky, what you want to tell him is that he has 12 uncles. And his 12 uncles are these 12 beings, and they have created 12 tribes. And what you're doing is taking this God out of the sky, this great pantheon of gods out of the sky, and bringing them down and making them a part of his own family. And so he gets another understanding, but what you really do is take what he's being taught and making it personally available to him in a way that it is not available even to those who are teaching him. They have this great pantheon, but it is out there somewhere. It's in a different world. It's not related to them. And they don't have a personal relationship with it. It isn't their heritage. The gods are up there. Man is down here. They're separated by this great chasm. So whatever they know about these cities in the sky or the god Ra, it is not a personal experience of theirs. But if all of those powers that the Egyptians are attributing to heaven are attributed to his grandfathers, his uncles, his family, his heritage, they become his. Now he has them in a personal family relationship where they have them in a cosmology that is cold and sterile. And he will have the greater power than they have, even from their own teaching. Got it? I think that's what happened. I haven't read that in any stories anywhere. But there was an obvious relationship between his understanding of the Egyptian cosmology and his understanding of his heritage as a child of the sons of Jacob. And he obviously put those two together for purposes of creating his own mystery school a bit later. Moses grows up in this setting, very privileged person. And we find that the Pharaoh, who was his grandfather, has now died. And the son is now the ruler, Ramses II. And the first thing that this new ruler does is that he sends workmen to go all over Egypt and find the most spectacular buildings and carve out of them all of the signatures on those buildings, giving credit to the builder, and carve into them his own name so that the generations following him will believe that he built all of those temples. So he took the credits away from all of the temples of Egypt and carved his own name in a little bit deeper, and left people believing for generations after him that he had built everything except the Great Pyramid, and he probably would have carved his name in that if he had gotten there. But he also built a lot of temples of his own. He added on to temples that were already built, added new balustrades and new rooms onto the front of them, made them more elaborate. He was constantly building during his entire time. And it was convenient for him that the Habiru, or the nomads, were available, because they became his slave force in this building. So suddenly these people who had been quite successful in Egypt were now almost like beasts of burden, carrying stones and building the great buildings of Ramses. And while Moses was still a part of the family, and it would have been a little difficult for Ramses to displace him, he still didn't quite have the stature that he had had before. But he was considered a wise man. After all, he was trained in the mystery schools. He was a magician. He was one of the wise men of Egypt, an advisor to the king. But he was now very much aware of his Hebrew or nomad heritage. And as he went out to watch the people at work, he was appalled at how his nation, his relations, were being treated. And it got to him one day when he saw one of the Egyptians beating one of the Hebrew workers, and he so lost his control that he killed the Egyptian, then worried about what he had done, buried him in the sand, and tried to conceal it until he heard somebody commenting about it the next day, and he got really scared. He realized that if it got back to the Pharaoh that he had killed an Egyptian, then the Pharaoh would forget that he had grown up as part of the Pharaoh's family, and notice that what he really was a Hebrew at heart, and a part of this rebellious nation. And he was frightened for his life. Interesting, by the way, that sometimes if we find ourselves in a comfortable situation and God wants us somewhere else, he will communicate with us in several ways to give us guidance to go elsewhere. But if the situation that we're living in is comfortable, we find it very easy to say, I have a good job here, I have my friends, I have my home, I really can't go out and do that. I mean, I really would like to go and study and learn more, but I mean, my family is here, it wouldn't be right to them, I wouldn't be being fair to the people who are dependent upon me. We find all of these excuses not to go. He grew up with the stories of the shepherd kings who built the pyramids. And that's really all that was known of them in Egypt at the time. There was an ancient race of kings who came here, and they were referred to in Egyptian stories, legends, as the shepherd kings. And they had done things that the pharaohs since them had been unable to do. But legend had it that the shepherd king still existed somewhere on earth. And so here's this young man growing up with the stories of the great shepherd kings of antiquity who actually became gods. One of them had become Osiris. And the gods of Egypt were said to have come from this family of shepherd kings. But where are they? But when he talked about these shepherd kings, this maid who took care of him, secretly his mother, said, do you know, that reminds me that our family comes from shepherd kings. The background of your uncles, your grandfathers, were the shepherd kings. That's the heritage of the Hebrews. And I think that we can find where the shepherd kings are. Now, when he had to flee Egypt, because he was in trouble, because he was scared to stay, all of a sudden now he had new motivation to follow God's will. I think maybe we should listen to that and make that a story for ourselves. The first point in this story that I think is important for us to really latch on to is that it's very possible that if Moses had listened to guidance, he wouldn't have had to get himself in trouble with the law to get him out of Egypt and to where God wanted him to be. What will God have to do to you to create the circumstances to make it uncomfortable for you to do anything else other than his will? Of course, you know about free will. Moses still had free will to stay in Egypt, didn't he? But there's a lesson in free will there. How much was that free will worth at this moment? I mean, his free will was to stay in Egypt. He was comfortable there, and if he hadn't killed somebody and gotten into trouble, he wouldn't have changed his will. Now, look at free will and see how much application there is there that's of importance to you. I have my own feelings about that. I have a feeling that we have free will, but we also have a teacher who's such a master of encouraging us to change our will, that free will is not always as free as we might like to think that it is. So they created this situation in which he used his free will to decide to leave the country, and he went to seek out a shepherd king. And he went to a place across the Gulf of Aqaba into Jordan, southern Jordan, and there he stopped by a well. Are those still up here? There it is. He stopped by a well. What does that mean? If we're going to jump now from history to interpretation, what happens when you go into a desert place and stop by a well?
You go down into your innermost being, into the depths of yourself to draw out the water of spirit.
Okay. So first of all, he gave up his own attitudes and opinions. He went into the desert. And without his own opinions or preferences, what the story says to me here is that he didn't know where he was going. If he hadn't stopped by the well, he wouldn't have found the shepherd king. But the well became his map. He went into the desert, which is the place of not knowing, wiping out opinions, and being free and available to guidance. So the important thing that he did was made his consciousness available to guidance. This is going into the desert place. When he found himself in the desert place, then he found a well, a place where he could draw from inside him the guidance, the life force that would take him to the right place. And while he was beside the well, he encountered 7 ladies. And guess what they were? What do you think? Okay, what do you think they did for a living? No, they weren't prostitutes. Not this time. They were shepherds. So he ran into 7 shepherdesses who were sisters. Isn't that fantastic? 7 shepherdesses who were sisters. Now here's an interesting twist on the story. He had to rescue them from shepherds. Now what's happening? Here's a Dr. Strange story for you. What we find here is that shepherds are those who shepherd their thoughts, and according to the understanding of the ancients, anyone who shepherds his thoughts is powerful, because the mind is a powerful instrument, an extremely powerful instrument, but only if it's brought under control. The suggestion is that your mind is an extremely powerful instrument, but not when it does what it wants to do. It just sort of goes the way that it wants to go, like sheep without a shepherd. Your thoughts are not potent, they are not directed, they are not focused, they are not disciplined, therefore they're not powerful. But one who does nothing more than begin to shepherd his thoughts and direct them to where he wants to go becomes an extremely powerful person. Or another word for this is an occultist, one who uses the power of the mind to cause an effect upon another. So we have 2 kinds of shepherds here. The female or receptive shepherd, suggesting that the shepherdess is receptive to God, receptive to guidance. And the male shepherd, who is one who is forcing his will. He is active. He is making things happen. So here are the receptive consciousness battling with the right-hand magicians battling with the left-hand magicians, and here is Moses becoming involved to rescue the receptive. And keep in mind now, if we are interpreting this like a dream, this is something that is happening inside you or inside Moses. He wrestled between his ability to cause things to happen and his ability to listen for guidance and let things happen. He had a mind of a shepherd, a mind that could direct his thoughts, but the battle in him was between whether to follow his own will and go one way, or to follow the receptive will, which was also disciplined, and go the other way. So the 7 sisters, the 7 shepherdesses in him, became the direction that he took. Or, to say that another way, the 7 centers or 7 chakras in him were at that moment dedicated to God. Now when you put this whole thing together, he comes to a well. He goes to the wellspring of life in him, and he finds a force of power, which can be shepherds or shepherdesses. And if we jump now to the book of Revelation, we find John describing this well of life with 7 seals or 7 cities, 7 books of knowledge, and they are guarded by an angel with drawn swords, but the sword has 2 halves. One cuts to destruction, the other opens the book to new life. And this is what Moses was faced with. He found the deep well where the water of life springs forth, and he found himself faced with a choice. Will you use that power to impose your will, the shepherds, or will you dedicate this to following God, the shepherdesses? And he rescued the shepherdesses from the shepherd. How many times are you going to have to do that in your life? Rescue the shepherdess in you from the shepherd in you. Rescue the ability to follow God's will from your own inclination to make things work your own way. He made the right choice, and the shepherdesses took him to their father. Isn't that neat? Natural. They took him home for dinner, and guess what he did then? Married the father's daughter. Married a shepherdess, and had a son by the shepherdess. Does the story begin to sound familiar? Remember, I told you it's the only story there is in all the Bible. And here it is happening again in the life of Moses. He marries the daughter of his teacher, marries the daughter of his source of enlightenment. It's the same story of the marriage at Cana. When you find that wellspring of life that is a source of guidance in you, if you become married to it, you give your life to it, you become one with it, and there is a result of it, a child, a new life. And that new life is the new direction in which you go. So he found his teacher, who was a shepherd king named Jethro. And by the way, Jethro is from the same root as Jesus. Or Jesse, father of David, father of light, or father of the Christ. So he was taken to this descendant of a shepherd king who just happened to have a mystery school, of course, in the middle of the desert in southern Jordan. Which, by the way, occurs again a little later. Peter studied there. The Apostle Paul studied there. The Therapeutae of ancient Greece studied there. So this mystery school, Moses was led to by making the right decision at the well. By following his inner guidance, or the shepherdess within him, he was taken to his teacher. His response to the teacher was to marry the daughter of the teacher. Now we find something interesting. The stories from the mystery schools happen all over. In every nation, in every land, they are told again and again. And here's the story. You know about Excalibur? Well, Excalibur just happened to be in Jethro's garden at this time, a little before King Arthur was born, of course. But what was there was a staff. And this staff was an almond branch that had a history. According to the Kabbalists, this stick goes all the way back to Adam and was put there by Adam. It was used by Noah. It was used by Enoch as his staff or his rod of life, and so on. But this staff was there and became Moses' staff, which he used. He was given this rod of life, a rod that buds when it is put to work. And again, this rod is the same thing that we're talking about, these 7 seals, the chakra system, the spine, the backbone. And he was taken to a high place while being a shepherd. Now, while watching the sheep is a time when I have directed my consciousness toward God. I have gone to a high place and I'm watching my sheep. This can happen to you. You don't have to go to Egypt to accomplish it. You have sheep and they are your thoughts, and you can watch those thoughts from a high place by going to a high place in consciousness. This is your meditation. You are elevating your consciousness to a high place, and there you encounter a fire in a bush or a tree. Significant that it is a bush or a tree, because now we're talking about a man who is trained in the mysticism of Israel and of Egypt, and this tree is the tree of life, and the tree of life is the way that man is formed. It is a tree with the 7 branches, with 10 branches coming from 7 roots. And it has its roots in heaven and its branches in earth. He encounters this bush that is burning with fire. And it is said that if you take this water from this deep well and you marry yourself to the 7 shepherdesses, you are following this guidance, and the water from that well reaches its highest point, then it burns and consumes all that you have been. At the well he had the baptism of water. At this high place in the presence of the bush he had a baptism of fire. Baptism of fire destroyed all that Moses had been, and transmuted or transformed him into what he could be. He became a new quality of being. And interestingly, he had limitations before that he didn't have afterward, and he communicated with this fire that burned in his consciousness at the high point, and he said, essentially he said, what's going on here? And the bush said, take off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground. And essentially what he's being told there is to ground himself, to get in contact with going on. One of the things that interests me about people who go into a beautiful experience in meditation or a beautiful spiritual experience, I've seen so many people who were so delighted at having the experience that when you ask them, what was the experience worth to you? What did it mean? What did it accomplish? What's its value? What did you learn from it? They look at you sort of funny and say, well, it was just a beautiful experience. Nice to have the beautiful experience, but what for? I mean, if you want fireworks or roller coaster rides, go to Disneyland. A mystical experience should be something that gives you something applicable, that makes a difference in your life. And the tree said, don't just be entertained by the spectacular presence. Take off your shoes, ground yourself, recognize the purpose of what you have here. Get in touch with what you're doing, make it of value. Take it to a place that makes a difference in your consciousness. And the bush began to give him instruction. My people are in Egypt. They are in bondage. I don't like what's going on there, and I need somebody to go and lead them out of there. Say, who are you? And the bush says to him, I'm life. I am the source of life. I am that which lives. I am living consciousness. The bush didn't identify itself, or the consciousness didn't identify itself with a Hebrew god or with an Egyptian god. didn't use a name that had been used for God as far as Moses knew. It didn't identify itself with a religion. It identified itself rather as the source of life, the source of consciousness, the source. The source of life, the source of mind, that which lives and gives life. I think that's important for us to consider there. Moses didn't approach that as a Hebrew God, a God of a religion, a God of a doctrine, a God of a belief, but simply the source of all that is. And in essence, we're saying he approached it as a virgin without preferences. He did not assume that is Yahweh. He didn't assume that is Elohim. He asked rather, who are you that speaks to me in this way? And it identified itself not as Elohim or as Yahweh, but as life and the source of life. And then, of course, he protested, I don't have the ability to do that. And you know, I can almost hear the bush thinking, I'm sure glad you realize that. That may be the most important thing that can happen to us when we encounter what God would have us do. I mean, we can always say, I feel as if I'm being guided to do this, but I don't have that ability. Well, doesn't it occur to you that God knows that? He knows you don't have that ability, and he's probably delighted. If he sent someone who had that ability, they would do it with their ability. And they would do what they wanted to do, and they would be following the shepherds instead of the shepherdesses. But he picked a man who did not speak well in public, said, I have a speech impediment. I mean, you can't send me down there to make these speeches. And God said, I've already taken care of that. I have somebody who's a really good speaker to make your speeches for you. And in essence, he said, I'm delighted that you know that you don't have the ability to do it. Your very knowledge of your lack of ability makes you available to me and dependent upon me to give you the ability that you need. And essentially, the bush was saying to him what Jesus said to his apostles later when he left them. They said, we can't go out and do the things that you do. And Jesus said, when you stand before a group, don't think about what you have to say, but open your mouth. Be bold enough to open your mouth, and I will speak. Get up in front and open your mouth and let it happen, and I will speak through you. And so the bush was saying to Moses, I know you don't have the ability, but I do. So you go and be strong enough, be bold enough to do it, and be dependent upon me, and I'll give you the abilities that you need. And with that instruction, Moses went and faced Ramses and challenged him to allow the people to go. And I think you're quite familiar with this story, the story of the plagues that followed when the Pharaoh refused. Now, one thing that I think we should be aware of is that Moses now is standing in the presence of the Magi of Egypt. Now, you can be absolutely certain that the Magi who were standing there were the teachers in this temple where Moses studied. He is facing the magicians who taught him magic. And I think that you can assume that his professors of magic were quite confident that they could handle this young upstart. After all, I taught him everything he knows. And here they were face to face with him challenging their wisdom. And here I think we might have a flashback. Here are these Magi who had taught him the secrets of astrology, of numerology, of dream interpretation, of the manipulation of subtle energies, and they were not poor magicians. I mean, even in spite of the fact that they had lost many of the ancient secrets, they still were initiates of a mystery school, and they still had exceptional qualities and abilities. They still accomplished things then that we would have a hard time doing today. These were exceptional men of wisdom. They knew psychology. They knew manipulation. They knew how to manipulate the Pharaoh. And here is Moses standing facing these men who taught him, and the advantage that he has, perhaps, must have come from his mother in those early days. All those magicians of Egypt were working with the gods out there, and Moses was working with his relatives, his family, something that was part of him. I mean, the God that Moses worked with was really his God in a personal relationship, internalized, and part of his experience, an experiential relationship with a personal being that he had communicated with directly and found guidance from. So we find one who knows about something competing with one who knows. And in this competition then, must have been a wonderful thing to watch. Wouldn't you love to be there in the patio of Ramses' great temple and watch these magicians turning rods into snakes and doing all of these wonderful things that we hear that people can do? There is still a pool there in this great temple at Luxor, a great square bathing pool that must have been beautiful at one time, a part of a garden. When you go to visit it now, it's all full of green slime, and you can just see the frogs coming out of it. And it must have been the first place that people encountered the frogs of the plague there in Egypt. Here's the pool on the one hand, and just a few hundred yards away, the Nile. And then through this period, the people of Egypt go through the plagues. I'm not going to talk about the symbology of that yet, because we're going to talk about the Passover and the plagues together. But what I want to get us to now is that through these plagues, Moses gained the right from the Pharaoh to take the people out of Israel and out of Egypt, the people of Israel out of Egypt and into the wilderness on their way to Canaan. Now, once he got this great crowd of people out of Egypt, the thing I want to look at it here is, here's this man trained in the mystery schools of Egypt. He is surrounded now with thousands of men, women, and children who grew up as underprivileged people, a slave class, who had to make bricks and carry bricks and mortar for the Egyptians. The only education that any of them had was the education that they might have gotten passed down from to them from fathers and grandfathers in a very informal manner. They no longer really had trades, except that was passed to them clandestinely by their fathers and attempted to be kept alive. They were not organized. They had no formal religion, no education, no institutions, no army, no government structure, absolutely no government structure. It was just Moses and these thousands of people. What do you do? There were several challenges that he was faced with, and to meet these challenges, he went to the top of a mountain. And on the top of the mountain, we all know that he was given the 10 Commandments. Interesting thing about these 10 Commandments, 5 of them stated as positive statements and 5 of them stated as negative statements. Thou shalt and thou shalt not. Polarity. And this polarity, of course, the 10 are the Sephiroth of the Tree of Life. So a power is set in motion. Part of it we are aware of through the statements themselves, thou shalt not. But there's a much greater significance behind this. He was given there on the mountain, according to the ancient Hebrew teachers, 3 things, called the Torah, the Mishnah, the Kabbalah. The Torah being the written law, that concrete that can be given to the people. The Mishnah, the understanding of the law, the mental understanding. The Kabbalah, the spiritual access to the source of the law. So the mental, the physical, the spiritual. This triune teaching of where to go was given to him, but it was not just the 10 Commandments. He was instructed in a lot of other things. He was instructed in the things that you need when you have thousands of people out in the desert and no sanitary facilities. He was given instruction in sanitation, sterilization, epidemic control, nutrition, government, how to organize the people into groups and make a pyramidal structure up to himself. Beneath himself, he was to choose 10 men. Each of those 10 men were to have 10 captains under them. Each of those 10 captains had 10 captains under them. This pyramidal structure, so that all of the people had access to their government representatives, who had access then to the higher representatives and so on to him. He structured at the same time the religious side, himself as the political leader, his brother as the priest and the beginning of the ecclesiastical structure, and then between the two of them and together they created the medical or healing structure and the educational structure, all as a part of the temple. Now what did he have to do? In order to make of thousands of people a nation, you must give to that nation a heritage. And that's the point that I wanted to come to with all of that I have said. What Moses had to do was to sit down and collect the stories that were told to him by his mother, and the stories that were told by the rabbis during this period of captivity, put those together in a sequence that will answer the questions of the people. Where does my nation come from? What is its background? Now, it may be at this point, this is after the Egyptian captivity, after the children of Israel are in the desert, it may be at this point that Abraham first had his name. And what I'm saying is, the name Abraham means father of a multitude. Now, it may be that nobody knew at this point what Abraham's name was, but when Moses had to put this story down to be passed on to the generations beyond him, what would he call this man that he traced his nation back to? Father of a multitude. It may have been Moses who named Abraham. I suggest that as this possibility just to point out that it is at this point in history that Genesis was written. And it was written looking back, and it was written for a purpose of doing two things. One is to create a national heritage and give the Hebrew people an identity, and two, to explain the beginnings of time and provide a cosmology that was the basis of their religion. But it need not be an elaborate cosmology like the Chaldean or the Egyptian cosmology with all of their gods and an explanation for each of those steps, because in their cosmology there was simply one supreme being who did what he had to do, and that was the limit of their cosmology, except for the angelic kingdom, which he gave very little explanation. He simply said that there are hosts of beings in heaven that do the work of God, but there is simply God and the result of his creation, and this God is all there is and is in all there is. So that being the cosmology, he needed to explain how the earth came into being, and perhaps through his great teaching in the Egyptian mystery schools, perhaps he knew from a physics point of view, maybe he knew step by step how all of this happened. Maybe he could have explained it all in an elaborate structure. But keep in mind that Moses was communicating this story for little Hebrew boys who had no educational background, were living in a desert. I mean, you just don't create a great elaborate cosmology that is technically difficult and correct according to physics and so on. It was not his purpose. He did, in fact, point out the correct sequence of events. It was pointless for him to say, we're going back millions and millions and millions of years in history. What does that mean to a nomad boy in the desert? 7 days was more appropriate for the 7 worlds that preceded. And so he used that these youngsters and uneducated people could understand, and he created this poetic story of creation that would communicate truth, but communicate it in a way that is acceptable and understandable to these people under these conditions, and would serve the purpose of the moment. Give them a national heritage, a relationship with God, establish the one God that is, as opposed to surrounded by superstitions of gods behind every corner and give them a concrete identity as a nation. And so came into being the book of Genesis. We're going to stop there for a break and come back and go back into Genesis now and bring us perhaps close to... Now we'll see if we can follow our outline and get through Genesis. Tomorrow night we're going to talk about the more esoteric parts, and what we want to do tonight is get through the familiarity, the sequence of events, and the deeper interpretation of the events, like, for example, the relationship of the tribes to the zodiac. We'll talk about those things tomorrow night. But we want to structure the story tonight. So we have come as far as Abraham and the birth of Isaac. We talked about the sacrifice of Isaac, the Abrahamic sacrifice. And the next thing that we find is in chapter 24, getting a bride for Isaac. And this is one of those things where you'll find over and over a story of the divine lover being alluded to in different ways, and so it is here. Abraham has come to the end of his life, and he calls in his servant and says, I want you to get a bride for Isaac, but the bride cannot come from these people where we are. Now, you have a man who's moved into a new state of consciousness, but he's living among people of a different state of consciousness. They are not where he is. But his son must be married to the consciousness that he has come out of, the consciousness that he is born from. So we have really a very esoteric story here, an important esoteric statement that now that I have given birth to a son, now that my new life has given birth to new life, I do not want that new life or new consciousness to be married to the things of the earth. I want it to be married to what I came from. So he sends his consciousness back to find a bride, or maybe from an esoteric point of view, we can say he's finding a purpose for the new life. If I'm interpreting this for myself, if I'm interpreting this as a dream, I have given birth to a son. This son is a new life. Now, this is the important thing to happen in my life, to give birth to this child of God within me. But what happens after I give birth? Now that I have given birth to a new life, and this new life is committed to God, it must now be applied. It must be married to a purpose. And now that I have found power, guidance, understanding through my new life, I should be able to be quite successful in the material world. There's a temptation. Why don't I marry my new abilities of using meditation to, to the stock exchange? Why don't I use my meditation and guidance abilities to tell me which stocks are to buy or whatever? That is marrying my son to the children of the earth, finding a bride among the people that surround me. But Abraham said to his servant, and again, what is the servant? This is one that we didn't put in the glossary, did we? The servant in us is one of our talents, one of our abilities, one of the powers within man. So I say to my servant, find a bride for my son from my heritage, from what gave birth to me. And so the servant is sent. And in fact, the servant says to Abraham, what if I can't bring a bride back from your country? Remember that Abraham had come from the Ur of the Chaldees, and he's sending his servant back to Ur to find a bride and bring her to Canaan, where they are living among these non-believers, we'll say. And it's a tricky business, isn't it, to be sent to a foreign country to bring a bride back to marry someone that she's never seen. And the servant says, what if she won't come? Shall I then take your son back there and have him find a bride? And Abraham said, under no circumstances are you to take him. You must bring the bride to him. If she won't come, then you are released from your vow to me. But under no circumstances are you to take him back. So we have two statements here. I want my son to be married to a purpose that comes out of my purpose for being. But I don't want to go back to where I came from in order to find that. I must send my consciousness to understand, but I don't want to turn back. I don't want to go back to the, if the Christ in me is born of Mara, the waters of bitter experience, I don't want to go back to the bitter experience to find that. But I do want to bring a bride from that heritage to him. So the servant is sent then. And he goes, I think you might find it interesting that the man that he encounters when he goes back to find the bride is a man named Laban. We're going to run into him again. The servant encounters a well. When he comes to the well, then he stops to pray. That's appropriate, isn't it? And I think that all these wells, and this is something we're going to run into over and over and over in story after story after story, especially when there's a marriage, it always occurs when the man goes to the well. Remember that Moses went to the well, and there he found the shepherdesses and subsequently married one of them. Now the servant is going to the well, and when he comes to the well, he is looking from the depths of that, a reflective surface from deep within me, to understand what to do. He stops and he prays, and he says to God, I want to arrange with my guidance that there will be a sign of the particular woman that I'm to bring back. And if a woman comes to this well, and I ask her for a drink of water, and if she says to me, let me not only give you a drink, but let me provide water for your camels, then if the woman says that, she will be the woman, and I will take her back with me, and that will be my sign. So he has given to his source a particular sign that he is looking for to indicate to him that this is the right person. He's asking his guidance to tell him which one, but he is giving his guidance a voice. This is something that I've found interesting. A lot of people want to get information in prayer and meditation or whatever, but they don't exactly provide for themselves a manner in which the information can come. This is one of the things that I've tried to do with Inner Light Consciousness. You can teach a person to meditate, and basically teaching a person to meditate is to empty the left brain, to get rid of thoughts and structures and images and so on. And once you have done that, once you've stopped this left brain chattering process, you are in meditation. But being in meditation is an empty place of silence. Understanding can come, but how does it come to you? What I've discovered is that if in this silence a person creates an image of something or listens to a sound, he has provided a sense through which the answer can come. If he's listening to a sound, such as a mantra, then from that sound can come the understanding. If he's using an image, perhaps he's going to image a telephone or a television screen or a movie screen, then he gives himself an imagery sense through which an answer can come. But he has provided a communication device to Spirit, and he has said to Spirit, let your answer come in this way. I open my consciousness to how the answer might come to me. So essentially this is what he's doing. He's not only asking for guidance, but he is suggesting a form through which this guidance can come. And according to the story, before he even finished his communication with his source, a beautiful woman comes to the well, and there he speaks to her and says, can I have a drink of water? And she says to him, let me not only give you a drink of water, but draw water for your camels as well. And of course his heart leaped, and it's working, this is just right. And so he talks with her, who are you, where are you from, who is your father, what's your background? And she tells him a bit, and he explains who he is and where he's from, that he's come from Abraham, and she runs to her brother and tells him of the stranger that has come. And the interesting thing is that the thing that increased her hospitality, perhaps, is that he had given her gold rings and bracelets and a necklace, and is obviously a wealthy man, and that makes her brother very receptive to his presence. So they lay out a dinner for him, and at dinner he begins to describe who he is and where he's from. And it happens that Laban, of course, is a distant cousin of Abraham, knows of the man in a distant kind of way, but most of all he's intrigued with the story that the man tells. I prayed that at the well, if she would say certain things, that would be a sign from God that she is the chosen one. Because she was chosen from God, Laban said, it is not a decision for me to make. If God has chosen her, then there's no decision for her or for me. If God has said, then she must go. So they left the decision to the source, and she went with him back to be married to Isaac. So Isaac then is married to his bride and has sons. And this brings us to an interesting story here of the twin sons, Esau and Jacob. A man of the earth, Esau, a hunter, a man who lives from the earth. And now we're sort of reversing the Cain and Abel story, because the man from the earth comes first. But the other man is born clinging to his heel. According to the story, there's a fight in the womb about who gets born first, because whoever gets born first has the birthright. And Esau appears to be the stronger, and he is born first. Unusual child with bright red hair, but this bright red hair covers his body. A hairy sort of a fellow. And he's named, according to that, his name indicating that was his nature. But the second one, born clinging to his heel, is given a name that means the supplanter. One who supplants the right of the one who came before him. A prophetic name, because Jacob did find it extremely important for himself that he have that birthright. An interesting thing is that it's important not only to him, but to us, to God, that he have that strength to gain that right, even though it is through deceit, even though it is through supplanting the right that is given. This supplanter must become the strong one that carries the line. Now, what does that mean? What happens in me when the supplanter comes along? The intriguing thing about this story for me is the relationship between it and a story that is told by Wilhelm in the translation of the Book of Changes, the I Ching. He tells the story of the Tao, that the Taoist sages say that when a question is born in the mind, that the question coming up in the mind impregnates the mind, and a child is born. And the first son, born as a result of a question in the mind, the first son is always a son named Truth. But he is born a twin, and his twin is born clinging to his heels. And his twin's name is Doubt. And doubt will supplant truth in the mind of a person to whom these twins are born. But then if the person wants to know truth, they must give birth to a third son who will avenge his first brother's death. And the third son's name is Stillness. And essentially the story says, if we want the child that should have the birthright, and in this case, it is neither of the first two twins. It is neither the man of the earth who has no interest in spiritual things, nor is it the clever supplanter, manipulator, master of deceit and disguise. Neither is he the man who must have the birthright, but it must be the third son. And the story essentially says this: you have within you a kernel of truth, a seed of truth. Essentially, the truth to any question that you need the answer to, the truth lies within you. The answer to any question that you need an answer to lies within you. And that which is within you, your source, your source of inspiration, your source of guidance, wants you to have that answer and is not reluctant to give you that answer. And according to these teachers, every time you ask a question, truth is born immediately. It pops up in response to that question if you need the answer. And the only question there is the need. This does not happen in questions of curiosity, but where there is a need to know, truth is born as a result of the question. And if we could accept that, if we could recognize it, if we are tuned enough to recognize it at the second of its birth, then we will accept that, and the second twin will die, or will be stillborn. But because we already have questions about our ability to know truth, because we already exist with doubt before we even ask the question, because we feel limited, because we lack faith, because we entertain fear, truth in response to the questions that we ask is always born a twin, with doubt clinging to the heel. And the second son, doubt, always robs the first son of his birthright, and the doubt always becomes stronger than the truth that it followed on the heels of. And very soon you don't even know what the first thought was, and doubt begins to entertain your mind with thoughts of, well, is it this or is it this that was first born? Which is the doubt and which is the truth? If I knew that, then I could get rid of doubt and truth would live. But doubt's voice confuses the entire issue so that the only thing that remains living is doubt and truth has died. Surely a situation you recognize, isn't it? Within the secret of what to do next, which is very simple, but seems to be very difficult too often to do, the instruction is, if you want the third son to be born, what you essentially do is shut up. You must still the doubt. You must silence. You must kill doubt with silence. You must kill the voice of doubt by being still. And the stillness is followed with the birth of silence, and followed then by the birth of persistence. The two daughters, silence and persistence, will cause the birth of the third daughter, whose name is Joy. And the birth of Joy is the realization of the original truth. The question is answered, and I come back to the Tao, or the place of peace. Now, this is the Chinese story that essentially relates to the same thing that we have here. We have within us Esau, the man of the earth, the man who is interested in adventure, he's interested in eating, he's interested in satisfying his appetites, he's interested in power, and not terribly interested in the spiritual things. But there's this supplanter, the one who creates doubt in his mind, the one who manipulates. And really, we're talking here about left brain and right brain again, or at least that's part of what we're talking about, and that would be oversimplified to say that's what the story is. But it is similar to that. It is our commitment to earth and our recognition of spiritual power within us. But when I say spiritual, I mean the ability to be sensitive, to be psychic, and so on. But now we're talking about the unrefined ability. It is not spiritualized. It is not committed to God. It is selfish. It's working in its own interests. So what we have is a consciousness that is born two-sided, left brain and right brain. But even the right brain is manipulative. It uses emotion. It uses selfishness to get its way. It fantasizes things and distorts the understanding of left brain so that neither side of our consciousness is committed to high purpose. And when Jacob then bargains for the birthright, deceives Esau when he's hungry by fixing him a meal, feeding him, getting the blessing from his father, then what he has done is discovered. He's in trouble for deceiving his father and his brother, and his brother goes to chase him and kill him. Here's Cain and Abel again. Cain is chasing Abel, except in this instance, Abel is not committed to God. He is the intuitive mind, but not committed to God. And Esau is chasing him. He is running. As he runs, he stops in the wilderness. Confusion. He stops in his confusion and stops for the night. Now, if there's anything worse than being in the wilderness, it's being in the wilderness at night. This is the dark night of the soul. In the dark night of the soul, he lies down on the ground with a rock, a stone, for his pillow. For those of you who have been through the dark night of the soul, all of that will probably feel familiar. Any pillow in the dark night of the soul feels like a rock. It's a hard place. It's an uncomfortable place. And in this uncomfortable place, he falls asleep. And he opens himself up. It is the dark night. The dark night itself is Mara, the birth of a new consciousness. And in this dark night, he sees heaven open and a ladder. And there are messengers coming and going on this ladder. Messages coming down from heaven and ascending to heaven at this place. A place that he calls Bethel, the house of God. And he constructs there a house of God. Now, what is a person who constructs a house of God? A temple builder. He becomes, through his dark night of the soul, he turns his manipulative ability, his intuitive ability, his determination, he turns all of those things from himself to heaven. He finds in the dark night of the soul, in the wilderness, a light comes out of the darkness and shows him that there are steps, a ladder with 7 rungs, leads him from where he has lived into a place of peace or heaven, and he finds out that from that place that is heaven, there are messengers, messages that can come and go, ascending and descending this ladder of lights. So in that time of the night, he is opened to heaven, and through his journey from where he is born into this far country,
He passes through the dark night of the soul, through the wilderness, makes a commitment to the kingdom of heaven, makes a commitment to opening that ladder, and of course this leads him to, guess what? Come on. A well. You got it. Comes to a well. And at that well, of course, he encounters a beautiful maiden. What else? These guys always seem to do it. Come to the well, find a lovely lady. And the well, of course, is, again, reaching into the depths of himself to find that reflection that is there, but reflecting his higher purpose that now has come as a result of his commitment. He has become one attuned to the kingdom of heaven within him. He has become, in a rudimentary way, a temple builder. Not literally a temple builder in the sense of the advanced initiate, but one who has begun to put together the stones of his life in a way to make it a temple to God. And that's the significance of his experience at Bethel. Now he comes to a well, and there he meets one of Laban's daughters. And Laban has two daughters, Leah and Rachel, and you know the story here, that he wants to marry Rachel. She's the younger daughter. And according to tradition there, and tradition being vitally important to these people, the older daughter must be married first. But he doesn't want to marry Leah. He finds Rachel charming, so he makes an arrangement with Laban. He doesn't have money for a dowry to provide for her, but his arrangement is that he will work for him 7 years to acquire this daughter. And so he works the 7 years to marry Rachel. But when the wedding ceremony comes, his bride arrives heavily veiled, and he is married to her, lifts the veil to kiss her, and discovers that it's Leah. And he has been married to the older daughter, is very frustrated and angry, but there seems to be no choice but to work 7 years for the other daughter so that he can be married to Rachel as well. So this 14 years he works and is married to both of these ladies. Now, what would you like to do with those 2 periods of 7 years? What would you relate that to? He worked 7 years to marry the beautiful lady who appealed to him and found himself married to the wrong one. The number 7 is a number of spiritual completion. He worked 7 periods of time to reach a higher state of consciousness, but he seemed to have reached something else, something that didn't satisfy him. What do you suppose happened here? You're so talkative.
Was that a time when he completed his cleansing from his deceiving his father?
Yeah, what would you call that? Okay. She got the word there. What we're talking about is karma. I can make a spiritual commitment and say, now I want to give my life to God. But what I want from giving my life to God now is this. I think it's not too infrequent that we find ourselves trying to marry Rachel when Leah is standing there in line. And Leah is the karma, the result of the experiences that we've already set in motion. We don't find her attractive, don't want to marry her, I want that one. And we say to God, I'll commit my life to you, but I don't want the result of what I have set in motion. I want the beauty of my commitment to God. And I work the first period of time to marry and meet the cause that I have set in motion. And I, through giving myself now to God, not to my own selfish purpose, then I reap what I was looking for in the first place. It's like saying, when I commit myself to God, but my work is done toward a particular goal that is what I want instead of what God has set out for me, I will get the result of my selfishness. When I go on then, fulfilling what God has set before me, then what I get, the second thing that I get is essentially, is really what I wanted in the first place. But my work will always result in the effect of the cause that I set in motion. So he works for karma, he works for grace. He receives his lady, and he is told then that it is time to go back and to take what he has now and put it to work. Again, this story is a commentary on going to where I need to go for my spiritual growth, and then taking responsibility to go back and meet those things that I had left behind, going back into the community itself to put this to work and to make application of the growth that I have experienced. So he starts back again, and he has another experience in the wilderness, and this time, in the period of the night, he encounters another angel. Not the ladder of lights, but this time he encounters a spiritual being in the middle of the night with whom he must wrestle. Now keep in mind that as he's going back, he is aware that the reason he left in the first place was because he had upset his brother Esau. And there's never been communication since, and the last he knew, Esau wanted to kill him. So he's going back with a great deal of dread. He's going back to face what he's set in motion, going back to face karma, and he goes back with fear and dread, knowing that he's going to have to encounter the anger that he had set in motion. So with this wrestling inside him, he has fear on the one hand, but a determination to follow God on the other. And with this anxiety churning in him, he goes into the wilderness. It leads us into the wilderness when we are following God, but we still hanging on to our fear. That will take us into confusion. And we feel really good by the fact that we're following God, even though we're afraid to do it. But if we just followed God and released the fear, it wouldn't lead us into the confusion or the dark night. But as long as we must take the fear with us, we are still following God. That's wonderful. But the fear that we carry along with us will add confusion to the experience, and it will not be all that it could have been. So he goes into the wilderness, into the confusion, into a dark night again, and this time he encounters the angel. The angel that he encounters is really the fear that he has brought with him, and they wrestle through the night. And as they are wrestling, Jacob is clinging to the angel, and the angel says to him, "Let me go, it's almost morning. You must release me before the light comes." And Jacob says to him, "I will not let you go until you bless me." This is perhaps one of the most important stories of the Old Testament to me, because it gives a key that we too often miss. I see people all the time around us struggling with spiritual growth. And in fact, throughout the fellowship, it seems to be a kind of a popular thing when you're going through a hard time to say, "I'm having mystery lessons today. I'm having lessons in this school of life. I am wrestling with something." And when we find ourselves wrestling with something, our financial problems, a love situation, a situation at work, trying to get along with somebody, things we are really wrestling with something, the thing that we seem to most want is to get it over with. I just wish this problem would go away. Now, when you say that, when you're in the middle of the problem and you're saying, what I want most of anything is for this problem to go away, that second, if you'll hear yourself thinking that, then what you really heard was the angel saying to you, "Let me go, it's almost morning." And you are saying, I'm willing to let you go right now. The thing I want most is to get it over with. Now, if you say that, the angel will leave you. It'll still be the middle of the night. You'll still be in the wilderness, and all that wrestling match got you absolutely nothing. If, on the other hand, when you come to that point of thinking, the thing I want most is to get rid of this wrestling match, if you can stop that thought and say, oh, no, I don't want to get rid of the wrestling match, I am going to say to the angel, the force behind this wrestling match, I'm going to say that I will not let you go until you bless me, until I get the answer that I need, until I recognize the source of this wrestling match and the power in me to overcome it. Having done that, then this same thing that challenged me this time will never have the power to challenge me again. If I do let the angel go in the middle of the night, I will encounter the same challenge again and again and again. That angel is going to come back and wrestle me every time I run into a similar situation, because I'll let him go. And keep in mind what he said. Let me go, it's almost morning. Almost morning means you're coming out of the dark night, and you will see what it was that you set in motion and how to handle it in the future. And most of all, the reason that the angel wants you to let him go is because he knows that if you wrestle him to morning, he becomes your servant. He works for you the rest of your life when you encounter those challenges, those situations. It is his responsibility to give you the power to overcome it. So he's willing to release the problem, but then the problem will come again and again and again. So that night, Jacob says, I won't let you go until you bless me. And he receives the blessing, and it's morning. He's also crippled by the experience. And that part of it, being crippled by the experience, is two things that have happened. He has been marked by the experience. He's changed by it. But essentially, he would not have had to have the wrestling match at all if he hadn't carried fear with obedience. So the mark that is the reminder of the wrong relationship is this mark that crippled him. It is not that every time you wrestle with an angel, you're going to wind up crippled. When you wrestle with the angel and you win, you're going to wind up with more power instead. But the statement here of being crippled by the experience is that it was an experience that he introduced that he didn't need to have. He didn't have to go into confusion, the dark night of the soul. If he had simply followed instruction, not bringing fear with him, that part of it wouldn't happen. But the most important thing, I think, in this story is for us to remember, when you are wrestling, don't let it go until you come out with understanding how you set the cause in motion that caused the wrestling match in the first place. Get acquainted with the angel and say to the angel, I don't want to get rid of this problem until the problem is solved, until I have mastered it, until I have the cooperation of the angel for future similar problems, so that it's not going to be a wrestling match in the future. He built a temple again there, and he called the place Peniel, a word that means a place where I met God face to face. He came face to face with God revealing himself in that place and named the place after it, and the angel gave him a name. His name became Israel, one who wrestles with God. And that name then became the name of anyone who wrestles with God, which is to say that any of us who are warrior kings, we are those who are wrestling in our relationship to come to a right place with God. It's like Israel are those who are wrestling with the challenges of life in order to move into the consciousness that is Emmanuel. Israel and Emmanuel are two steps or two levels in relationship to God, and I want to go from Jacob, the supplanter, and become Israel so that I become Emmanuel. And those are the three levels of initiation that we are looking for. So the name is the name of anyone who goes through the dark night, wrestles with this commitment, and makes this commitment. So his name is changed to Israel, and so his descendants are called Israel. And that night at Peniel, the nation Israel is born. This is the beginning of the people called Israel. He encounters Esau on the way back and finds that Esau is not angry after all, but is delighted to meet him, brings him gifts, welcomes him, and so on. But before the end of their time, they are estranged again. And a prophecy is made at that time, which I think is vitally important, because it's important to our generation. We're talking now about 2 ages ago. We're talking about the age of Aries. We've come through the age of Pisces, and we are on the brink of a new age, Aquarius. And the prophecy that was given there at the end of that age said that when Esau returns to Jacob, it will be the beginning of the age of peace. Now, we have encountered in our generation an interesting phenomena in which the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, went to Jerusalem and greeted the prime minister of Israel at the airport in Israel, embraced him and said to him, "I am Esau, returning to Jacob." Those were the words of Sadat to Begin. And I have personally no doubt that it was the fulfillment of that prophecy. The beginning of the Aquarian age was signaled by that movement, which doesn't mean that we now have promise of peace in the Middle East, but we have a beginning of the process that will move us into a new age of consciousness. Each 2,000 years there is a major change in world history that leads us into a new age. Our generation is that cusp of that new age, and major events such as that particular one will happen now to change the structure of politics, religion, relationships, thinking, and we will find a change in the direction of man's consciousness similar to the changes that we have spoken of already. There was a change at the time of the flood, coming from the many gods to the one God. There was a change 2,000 years later, coming out of legalism, the era of Saturn, into the era of Jupiter, where legal restrictions to make a person spiritual changed into the expansiveness of love to produce the same result through love rather than through orders and restriction. And the next age then is that of the regenerated person reaching out to help others, learning to